Hey Channel Insiders, welcome back to Channel Insider Partner POV, your source for untapped opportunities and unfiltered opinions in the IT channel, all to help you make better business decisions. I'm your host, Katie Bavoso. My guest today is Ozan Unlu, CEO and founder of Edge Delta, a startup using expertise and AI to create a next-generation observability platform for a world where company data is growing at an explosive rate. Ozan, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me, Katie.
Thanks so much for being here. I have heard so much about Edge Delta in the past couple of weeks leading up to us getting to record. Very excited to see that you came with swag and you got that plant in the background to be able to match the logo as well. So thanks for being prepared on that level.
Yeah, I try to make sure that I have a green thumb and try to keep many things alive, including the startup. And that way, the startups and the plants can be alive and thrive.
So let's talk a little bit about Edge Delta. When did you enter the market? And just talk to me a little bit about how you describe what Edge Delta is and does.
Yeah, so we got our initial seed round of funding just over 4 years ago at this point, 4.5 years ago. And so for Edge Delta, we're in the observability space. And interestingly enough, when I think about, and I've been in this space for about almost 20 years at this point, when I think about 20 years ago, the data volumes that were being created compared to today were obviously minuscule. But even going back to 7 or 8 years ago, the average customer might have only had maybe 5 or 10 gigabytes of machine data they were creating every single day. And machine data is kind of defined as logs, metrics, events, traces, etc. The same customers that we saw that had 5 or 10 gigabytes, this was, about 7 or 8 years ago, they now have close to, let's say, 5 or 10 terabytes. And some of the customers that we work with, some of the large organizations we work with, have petabytes of data they're creating every single day. And so it's not just that the data volume is growing a little bit, it's that it is orders of magnitude larger than it was earlier. And I think for that, you do need a brand new architecture. I think if you look at, the concept of databases or data stores or data warehouses, that concept has existed for a long time. If you look at streaming platforms, most notably platforms like Kafka, for instance, they've also existed for quite some time and probably got more popular over the last 5 or 10 years. And then we look at what Edge Delta is doing as a very unique third part of the architecture, which is how do you have distributed pre-processing and pre-aggregation of your data sets? And also, how do you use pipelines to be able to have a full understanding and control of your data set? So realistically, we're looking at ourselves as kind of a next generation observability platform. And that starts with observability pipelines. And that ends with the ability to curate data to be able to have continuous inferencing from AI.
I'm curious to know, with the customers that you work with, why are they seeing such an explosion of data? Is it having anything to do with the amount of the way they're doing work because they're siloed now since the pandemic? Is there anything you can point to in which you could say this is the reason the data is just exploding for them?
I think just the architectures are changing so much, right? I had the privilege of working at Microsoft. This is, quite some time ago. But, at the time at Microsoft, there were a lot of resources that we had to be able to go spin up virtual servers or virtual resources or even physical machines that we had access to. And Microsoft was probably one of the very few companies at that scale that had those type of resources. And so I think, today, sometimes people call them cloud babies, right? Like the companies that are created and exist in the cloud. And for some of these new companies, they have a tremendous amount of infrastructure that they can go and spin up very quickly. So you combine that with like containerization technologies like Kubernetes, and all of a sudden you have a lot of components, all of which creating a lot of data. And, it's not just that the data is growing in a single vector, it's that it's growing in numerous different vectors. And so, in that case, the matrix gets quite big and therefore the data sets get quite big. So I think that's just in general for companies. It's not just simply, hey, I had, 1,000 customers yesterday, and then a week from now I have 1,001. With the change in architectures and microservices models and everything else, we are seeing just such a massive growth of data. And also, I think the timeline, the horizon of a growth of a company is also accelerating, right? Mm-hmm. So you're seeing companies grow a lot quicker, in which case, the same architecture and the same observability platform they want to implement today might not scale to what they need tomorrow or next week or next month.
A lot of that growth, especially as we see so much M&A activity going on in both the channel, the IT vendor space, the technology vendor space. So I can imagine that there's a lot more needed when it comes to that observability. Speaking of which, talk to me about Edge Delta's differentiators in the observability space? It's a term that I hear a lot more now. This is obviously not the only company that does this and specializes in it, but where did you see a gap that needed to be filled by Edge Delta's existence?
We are the original player in the space doing intelligent pipelines that are the most flexible, they're the most scalable, and they allow you to have full understanding and control of your data sets. So, we're pretty proud about that. That's really from an end-to-end scenario. We, again, look at, databases or data warehouses or data stores. We look at streaming platforms, and we look at the edge. Our name, obviously, Edge Delta, is kind of a throwback to that, right? It's saying, hey, observability pipelines start at the edge. Your data starts at the edge. And we are the original players in that space. The other part about it is that AI, although extremely powerful, is very difficult to build a business on if you're not hyper aware of margins, right? And so in our space where so much data is created, you cannot take the same lazy approach of saying, well, for instance, in observability, you could say, hey, I have a low value data set. It's very large. I want to go throw that in S3 first, right? S3 is obviously Amazon's, object storage. Obviously, Azure and GCP have their equivalents as well. And you can do that and you can say, I want to go work with this data later. Well, with very large data sets, you actually have to find a way to curate that data and to pre-process and pre-aggregate and effectively figure out, of all this data, of all these terabytes and potentially petabytes, what are the unique things that I want to go, effectively tokenize and put into an AI model for, even if it's just for inferencing. And that is an entire kind of, science and business on its own. So I would say specifically in observability, an area that has a lot of data sets being created at all times, I would say that we are at the forefront of also being very differentiated in the market for how do we curate observability data sets to be able to get continuous inferencing from these models.
Without giving away this recipe for the secret sauce, so to speak, can you talk to me a bit more about how AI is used? Can you walk me through maybe a scenario in which AI, we'd see it in real time functioning inside of the Edge Delta product?
Yeah, so we just released our first real big AI feature called OnCall AI. And so what OnCall AI is, much like its name might suggest, is that there's a concept of on-call in observability, which is basically, hey, who is the first person that goes and takes a look at something when there's an alarm or there's an issue or there's an alert or there's, something that basically says, hey, even if it's 3 a.m, the person has to wake up, they have to open their laptop, as their eyes are adjusting, they're trying to figure out what's going on with the infrastructure. That is a reality for many people that are, in the SRE, DevOps, observability space. And OnCall AI, the very first thing it does is it says, hey, why don't we have an AI first take a look? And we are big believers that at the end of the day, AI can look at things, it can have opinions, it could even recommend things. But ultimately, the engineers, the professionals, they do need to decide, right? And so OnCall AI is really kind of a technology that is on that same wavelength, which is effectively, hey, let's go and have AI do the first pass and say, hey, what are the issues that are happening right now in real time? What do we suggest as a potential resolution? And it allows them to, instead of, waking up at 3 a.m. and starting at square one, maybe they're starting at square, 4 or 5, right? Where it gives them a little bit of a head start to say, okay, maybe this is right on the money. Maybe it's a little bit off, but, either way, I love to have another opinion that just informs me in real time.
So I've already thought of the tagline, On-Call AI, giving engineers more hours to sleep.
Yeah, that's not bad.
I'd love to talk about your customer experiences with Edge Delta. Can you point to a specific customer success story in which you were able to help a customer have a better business outcome?
We actually did just release a great video that includes Ben Koos, CTO of Box. They're a very happy customer of ours, and we're very appreciative of the partnership with them. And I think for them, as Ben talks about in the video, there is this concept of optimizing data sets, right? And so, if you take a look at logs, for example, not every single log is super critical. And when you're creating terabytes or even petabytes of log data a day, not every single piece of that data needs to go through a very expensive ingestion architecture. And so, the concept of pipelines then enables you to apply this concept of data tiering. And that, and many times, can reduce your cost by 90, 95, even 99% in certain cases. Now, we never like to promise a 99%. We don't even like to promise 90%. But the reality is for certain use cases and certain, data sets, you absolutely can reduce your costs quite a bit. The other part of it that really helps out is that it allows you to have a full understanding of your data sets and how they're being used. And so, you might look at your data sets and say, hey, these log messages are, whether we're doing logs to metrics conversion on them and we're seeing those metrics on the dashboard, or we're alerting on the metric that comes out of the log, or we're alerting on the logs themselves. There's a lot of different use cases that you can use this data for. And just having an understanding of what data is being used and what data is not being used, I think that's a really big value for organizations.
Moving on from there, I'd love to talk about the hyperscalers that Edge Delta works with and helps run on top of. Can you talk to me about your relationship with them and which one specifically you're working in tandem with?
Yeah, I would say that we're, working with the big three. So my background, I was actually a software developer on the Azure team in a different lifetime. And so, obviously we work with Azure quite a bit. We also have a lot of our infrastructure that's on AWS. And then, I was just at Google Next, which is GCP's big conference down in Vegas a few weeks ago. So I think what we try to do is stay pretty agnostic. A lot of our customers also are big enterprises that want kind of, their multi-cloud strategies. So we have to make sure that we're potentially up and available in multiple different clouds. So I would say we do have our preferences on what we do with which hyperscaler. But that being said, I think we're seeing a huge kind of shift in the space, obviously due to AI is a big part of that, right? We saw what Microsoft was doing with their investment in OpenAI. And I think in many ways, Amazon and GCP kind of got caught a little bit on their back foot. But, then they're making their own kind of strides and investments there as well with AWS Bedrock and GCP is doing their own things as well. So yeah, I think it's an exciting space. I think you don't ever want to shut the door on any hyperscaler. So I think they all have their place and they all have their pros and cons and what they're good at.
Going on from there, the channel overlap that Edge Delta has, do you work with other channel solution providers, whether they be MSPs, VARs, integrators? Can any of them find a benefit in working with Edge Delta to be able to close more deals with customers or maybe enter a market they hadn't been in before?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the way that we like to approach new partnerships is really to look at, hey, are there just simply one or two customers that we can go and talk to and go, really allow them to pull their observability initiatives in a much more modern direction. And I think for us, if you look again at that three different components of observability, one being your data store, the second being the streaming layer, Edge Delta really is that third piece of the puzzle. And I think for us, we are very happy to work with any type of partnership or channel partner. If we've identified, hey, we have a customer over here that, they've been using Splunk for years, or they've been using Datadog for years, and whether the system is just getting kind of old and the performance is kind of degrading, or if the costs are out of control, or if they're just wanting to go in a new, fresh direction, Edge Delta is going to be the future of the architecture that's underlying for observability. And so we're always happy to chat about that. I think, our product also can get up and running in minutes. We have an open trial that anyone can go use. And so we typically like to come in and talk to the customer and really work with them. And then last week, I was traveling in Texas, and we got a new customer up and running in a matter of minutes. I think it was 3 or 4 minutes that they created their account, added some sources, immediately started seeing insights. It's quite funny because from like a proof of concept or a proof of value perspective, realistically, the red tape is much more in the actual business process, whereas the technical requirements literally can be solved in minutes. So I think we'd be excited to work with any new partner. And I think for us, instead of trying to boil the ocean, it's really about identifying one or two, potential customers that we can work with. And the other part of it is that we're really confident in the product. So, we want to put the product first. We want to get it in the hands of our potential end user. And, I think the product can do a lot of that work itself.
Very well said. Very interesting to hear about that relationship that they can expand on with you. I want to talk about you now. Let's talk a little bit about your career. In researching you, it was really interesting to learn what you've done. You mentioned working with Microsoft, but you've also worked with other vendors that I would never have said this before, but you've worked for Boeing, which I think is amazing. You've worked for Sumotech. You've worked as a nanoscientist. That's your background. Talk to me about your journey to becoming CEO and founder of Edge Delta. Just walk me through that career path and where you said, hey, there's an opportunity for me in this space that perhaps is nothing like what I'm doing right now. Talk to me about your journey.
When I was in the nanotech field, I was still a student at University of Washington. And the most interesting part about that, if you look at, let's take Reddit, for example. I think Reddit is famous for some new technologies posted, And then I think the top comment is always like, cool, we'll see it in like 20 years once it's productionized, right? I think there's so much very intriguing and interesting things happening in the research space that realistically won't get productized at a massive scale anytime in the next 10 or 15 years. That was my experience at nanotech. Was there were some phenomenally amazing things that you could do in nanotech, but realistically the big problem was, how do you actually get it to work at scale? One of those examples was you could literally spit into like a petri dish, and you could take a carbon nanotip and you could basically go and look under a microscope after putting it in the saliva. And you could look and you could see actually, oh, are there like cancer particles in someone's saliva? And even to the point where you could identify to say, okay, what type of cancer or where in the body is that cancer? 20 years ago, the challenge was like, well, you couldn't manufacture these nanotips. So us as effectively in the lab as scientists, we had to manually with our bare hands basically pull out and manufacture these nanotips one by one. And so, there was a lot of research at the time going into how do you basically create these nanotips at scale. When I was at Microsoft, I was always a good developer at Microsoft. I think for Microsoft standards, I don't think I was ever a superstar. So, I think for me, and I had some friends that were saying, hey, look, you have some soft skills, you have some business understanding as well. I'd hate for you to only live in the code. Sometimes I look back and actually that was the most fun I ever had in tech. But it definitely did draw me to go to Sumo Logic, where, I was the first sales engineer on the mid-market team there. And the sales engineer or solution architecture or field engineer, there's a lot of names for that role. But that really allowed me to kind of marry not only my technical expertise, but also my business acumen and being able to kind of have the soft skills and presentation skills and being able to work with customers. So the most exciting part about that probably in that transition was, at Microsoft, you work on a single project for maybe 6-9 months. And maybe you know more about that area than anyone else in the world. But then maybe 95% of that knowledge or experience doesn't really translate to the next role. Mm-hmm. When you're working with so many customers, and I think in my first year there, I probably worked with 200, 300 different customers, you get to see a very, very large breadth of understanding of what's happening in the market. How are various different organizations kind of implementing these technologies? And so whereas I was very, very deep in certain areas at Microsoft, the kind of breadth at Sumo Logic was a breath of fresh air for sure. And so from there, being able to have both a technical and a business background, I was able to identify certain things in the market. And that's what I always try to encourage early founders that have kind of ambitions to be entrepreneurial and be a founder and create their new thing, is make sure that you are an expert in the space. Make sure it's an area that you have years and years of intimate knowledge on. And therefore, you can make a very educated understanding and a guess of, hey, here's a gap in the market, and here's where I want to go build my initial MVP.
If I am an IT buyer, if I am in the channel and interested in working alongside Edge Delta, or I just want to learn more, where can I go?
We are always happy to chat. You can go to our website and you can sign up for a demo, and we will jump on a call with you and walk you through our product. But it's also open. So you can go right to our website. You can start a free trial and try it yourself, edgedelta.com. You can either request a demo or you can try it yourself, and we'd love the feedback.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today, Ozan. I look forward to having you back in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Katie.
Thanks so much to Ozan for joining me today, and thank you for watching or listening to this episode of Channel Insider Partner POV. You can check out all episodes on our website, channelinsider.com, or watch on our YouTube page at channelinsider_news and trends. You can also listen to the podcast version on your favorite podcast listening platform, like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow to never miss an episode. Once again, I'm Katie Bavoso, and I'll see you next time.